τον κύριο Νικία κοντά μας. Θεωρούμε τιμή μας που συνεργαζόμαστε σε τέτοιου είδους εκδηλώσεις πέραν από τα μαθήματα με το Πανεπιστήμιο Πειραιά. Με αυτά τα λόγια παραχωρώ το βήμα στο Πανεπιστήμιο Πειραιώς.
Σας ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ. Θα ζητήσω από τον κοσμήτορα, τον καθηγητή κύριο Σφακιανάκη, να πει ορισμένες κουβέντες εισαγωγικά πριν την αρχή της εκδήλωσης. Σας ευχαριστώ. Κύριε Σφακιανάκη.
Καλησπέρα σας και από μένα. Είναι ιδιαίτερη η χαρά μου για την απόψινή εκδήλωση. Θα ήθελα πρώτα απ' όλα να προσφωνήσω και να ευχαριστήσω τον διακεκριμένο συνάδελφο πλέον, μια που είναι επίτιμος διδάκτορας του Πανεπιστημίου μας, που θα είναι απόψε και θα φωτίσει την απόψινή εκδήλωση. Παράλληλα, θα ήθελα να πω ότι νιώθω και ιδιαίτερα χαρούμενος για τη συνέργεια και θα ήθελα να συγχαρώ και τους προέδρους αλλά και τους συντελεστές καθηγητές σε αυτή τη συνέργεια μεταξύ του Τμήματος Διεθνών Υπουργών Σπουδών και του Τμήματος Πληροφορικής που έχει να κάνει με την απόψινή εκδήλωση. Οι συνέργειες και η εξωστρέφεια είναι δύο βασικοί πυλώνες που έχει υιοθετήσει το Πανεπιστήμιο Πειραιά και που πιστεύω ότι το μέλλον θα μπορέσει να δώσει όσο γίνεται περισσότερο να δοθεί όσο γίνεται περισσότερο η έμφαση σε αυτούς τους δύο πυλώνες. Ο ένας πυλώνας λοιπόν που έχει να κάνει με τη συνέργεια φωτίζεται σήμερα και γι' αυτό είμαι ιδιαίτερα χαρούμενος, όπως θεωρώ ότι και το θέμα της απόψινής εκδήλωσης είναι ιδιαίτερα σημαντικό, που γίνεται ακόμα σημαντικότερο από τον φίλο τον Μαξ που είναι εδώ, και δεν θα ήθελα να πω τίποτα άλλο. Εύχομαι να έχουμε μια πολύ καλή απόψινή εκδήλωση. Να είστε καλά.
Καλησπέρα σας. Θα αρχίσω στα ελληνικά και μετά η εκδήλωση, επειδή είναι και για το American Studies και για το τμήμα μας και για το Συμβούλιο Εξωτερικής Πολιτικής, θα το γυρίσω στα αγγλικά. Αλλά πρώτα θέλω να ευχαριστήσω ξανά με μεγάλη χαρά το Ίδρυμα Λασκαρίδη. Το Ίδρυμα Λασκαρίδη μας παραχωρεί κατ' εξαίρεση αυτήν την υπέροχη αίθουσα και μας κάνει να φαινόμαστε όχι μόνο καλοί, αλλά αυτή η αίθουσα μας εμπνέει. Νομίζω ειδικά απευθυνόμενοι σε επιστήμονες, σε πανεπιστημιακούς, σε ανθρώπους που είναι σκεπτόμενοι, εδώ είναι σαν να μας μεταφέρει σε έναν άλλο κόσμο, σε μια άλλη κατάσταση, και ξέρω ότι τηρούμε βέβαια όλα τα μέτρα, social distancing, σε προηγούμενες εκδηλώσεις θέλουμε να έχουμε περισσότερο κόσμο, τώρα θέλαμε να έχουμε όσο μας επιτρέπει το Ίδρυμα, αλλά είναι πραγματική προσφορά και σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω και πάλι τον κοσμήτορα, εγώ λέω τον κοσμήτορα της καρδιάς μας, τον καθηγητή κύριο Σφακιανάκη, ο οποίος είναι αρρωγός σε όλες μας τις εκδηλώσεις εδώ και πάρα πολλά χρόνια. Πολλές φορές λέμε στο Πανεπιστήμιο τρώγονται μεταξύ τους. Είναι από 20-21 χρόνια. Στην κυρία Ασδεράκη, η οποία είναι στυλοβάτης του τμήματος που μας βοηθάει τόσο πολύ με ευρωπαϊκά προγράμματα, στον κύριο Γαλανό, τώρα θα ξεχάσω ένα-δυο και θα έχουμε προβλήματα σε όλους τους συναδέλφους που ήρθαν εδώ. Ειδική μνήμα θα κάνω στην Κωνσταντίνα Μπότσιου, η οποία έχει εκλεγεί στο τμήμα μας, περιμένουμε το διορισμό της, η οποία έρχεται άλλο ένα αστέρι που έρχεται στο τμήμα μας, και μας βοηθάει πάρα πολύ. Και θέλω να ευχαριστήσω και όλους όσους είστε σήμερα εδώ. Και τώρα θα μου επιτρέψετε να αλλάξω γλώσσα, να μιλήσω στα αγγλικά για να είμαστε και εντάξει, και θα πω πολύ σύντομα 2 λόγια. Έλεγα προηγουμένως στον κύριο Νικία, ξέρετε, καμιά φορά οι καθηγητές έχουν την τάση να μιλάνε πολύ και φοβάμαι ότι θα πέσω εγώ σε αυτό που είπα, οπότε θα κοιτάξω να πάω γρήγορα. So thank you, dear all, thank you very much for being here. Let me start by saying something about Professor Chrysostomos Nikias, because sometimes it so happens in life that people become part of your extended family. And Professor Nikias is part of our extended family, and I will give you a peek into his personality by providing you with information about 3 speeches that he has given here. The first one, 4 years ago, we were honored by giving him an honorary doctorate at our department, and he gave a memorable speech on leadership and the ancient authors, focusing primarily on Xenophon. By the way, Professor Nikias is an engineer by training, so let that sink in for a minute. 2 years later, Professor Nikias was back here, actually right here, and he gave us a wonderful speech on online education and the future. And that was just before the pandemic came in, and that helped us understand the future in education and all its vicissitudes online. And today, he's going to be talking about semiconductors, which is one of the hottest topics in the world, using his training as an engineer, but also sitting on the board of one of the most important companies that produce or help produce semiconductors, Synopsys. What does that say about our speaker? It says that he's a Renaissance man. Think about it. It could be online education or Xenophon or semiconductors. That's rare. And it is truly our honor to benefit from his wisdom. Let me also say that this event today is sponsored by the American Studies graduate program of the University of Piraeus. This is the first such program in Greek history. It took 2 centuries to have any degree, undergraduate or graduate, devoted to the United States of America. I'm honored to be the first director, and it's completely taught in English in cooperation with New York University. So we're going to have American professors coming here. We're going to have a summer school in Nidra and various other events, and eventually we'll be going back for educational excursions in the United States. And it's also co-sponsored by the Council for International Relations Greece. Professor Nikias, again, our extended family, he has honored us by being the president of the International Advisory Board, which is now renamed the Board of Counselors as of tonight. So brand new name. And he has been helping us. CFIR-GR was founded by 62 original founding members. Virtually every single Greek professor who teaches international relations, international economics, international institutions. So we definitely have the brain power there. We've been expanding our memberships. We've been doing a number of events, including a series on grand strategy that is going to be published soon, having the top leaders in Greece, current leaders, talking to us about Greek grand strategy. And one of the things that we do not want to do is what everyone else does. Yes, of course, we'll talk about Turkey and Cyprus, very important issues to Greece. We cannot neglect them. But we were the first organization to do an event on AUKUS. We were the first, as far as I know, organization to do an event on nuclear proliferation, or at least for the past decade. And today, we are the first organization to be doing an event on one, as we will see, the most crucial events and aspects in global politics today, which is the issue of semiconductors. Now, before we start, and before I call upon Professor Nikias to deliver his remarks, let me first start by introducing very briefly, because they need no introduction, our 2 moderators. I'll start with Professor Tsikhridis. Now, should I spill the beans? He has a special relationship with Professor Nikias dating back to the United States. I think he was his PhD student. So there's a bond that has been created there. Is that correct? Postdoctoral student. So at an even higher level of expertise. It's a small world indeed. And so we're very honored. In fact, we love the fact that another department at our university, and we have several representatives of other departments here, are joining forces for this event, because in reality, a lot of events do not belong to one discipline, but are multidisciplinary, just as is Professor Nikias. And then my mentor and the chair of our department, Professor Athanasios Platias, who I have to say I was deeply honored and thrilled to hear him give an amazing extended analysis on Themistocles only a few days ago. And but today again, we have Renaissance men and women here. He's going to be talking or commenting on semiconductors. So let me first ask Professor Tsikridis and Professor Platias to come and sit up here. Thank you very much. And now comes the main show. Professor Chrysostomos Nikias, thank you very much for making it back to Greece from LA, and the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Aris. Good evening, everyone. And again, I'm very grateful to the Laskaridis Foundation for hosting this event. As Aris already pointed out, this is my third time that I will speak under its auspices and the University of Piraeus, and I'm truly grateful. Dis Vagianakis, thank you so much for hosting me today again. And it's truly a pleasure for me to speak about one of my most favorite subjects, which is the heart and soul of electronic technology. Semiconductor chips, and more specifically, the current upheavals roiling the global semiconductor industry. But seriously, who would have thought even 10 years ago that semiconductor chips would become the world's most important industry? Sales of semiconductor industry alone total about $500 billion last year. No other industry has the same mix of hard sciences, brutal capital intensity, and what I would call diabolically cruel complexity. And that's why the most advanced technology is not easy to steal or copy. As I'm sure you're all aware, we are currently experiencing a worldwide shortage of semiconductor chips. It's having a significant impact on the world's economy and actually creating fears for more inflation. The most visible impact is probably in the auto industry. Factories have shut down because they cannot secure the chips needed to make cars. Actually, this afternoon I received a Wall Street Journal alert pointing out that Ford Motor Company announced that they're going to begin designing their own semiconductor chips, forming a partnership with Global Foundry, which is a company that Intel is in the process of buying. 10 years ago, a car would require 10 to 20 semiconductor chips, but today, most cars that we buy have more than 200. The new Ford Mustang Mach-E car has almost 3,000 semiconductor chips. So the future cars will be nothing else but the vast collection of semiconductor chips on wheels, and actually communicating with each other and with the cloud. Even the low-end chips, those that are used in television, TVs, or other home appliances, security cameras, and so on, are all in short supply. Consumers not only cannot find or are waiting for months for the products they desire, but they are paying higher prices for those that are available. So this chip shortage has been apparent for many months, and I can tell you that it may well last into next year and probably for a couple of years. It could get worse before it gets better. The COVID-19 pandemic that has disrupted the entire global economy, including many supply chains, is not over yet, and we do not know when it will end. There are many other elements contributing to this exceedingly complex problem. I will try to touch on all of them today. If this were a simple problem, it would have found the solution already. But the single most important factor affecting semiconductors is the Cold War-style tensions that have slowly developed in recent years between the United States and China. The geopolitics of semiconductors are rooted in the starkly different systems of governance of the world's two largest economies. To put it bluntly, it is democracy versus autocracy. This global ideological struggle between China and the United States manifests itself primarily through geopolitical, economic, and technological competition. And semiconductor chips lie at the very heart of it. The current tension over semiconductors burst into public view 4 years ago, in 2017, when the Trump administration, citing national security reasons, moved to cut off the supply of cutting-edge, very advanced semiconductors to China's 5G powerhouse, Huawei. The United States enlisted its European and Asian allies in an effort to not only stop the flow of the most advanced chips to China, but to also cut off access to semiconductor fabrication equipment and technology. Companies in other countries have little choice but to go along with this policy because the United States holds intellectual property rights to many of the key underlying technologies. The restrictions that started with a narrow effort aimed at Huawei now affects at least 60 Chinese firms, including SMIC, which is China's chip champion, and Xiaomi, the world's second largest smartphone maker after Samsung. The Biden administration not only continued the restrictions, but in March of 2021, just last March, imposed even tighter conditions for the companies on the entity list. So while the United States, and I'm sure you're reading, is politically very polarized, there is strong bipartisan support for tougher policies on technology transfer to China. In fact, of one of the bills that were passed through Congress, through the Senate, the vote was 94 in favor, 1 against. When on everything else in the Senate, it's either 50-50, or if it passes, it's 51 votes in favor, 49 against. But any restrictions when it comes to China, then it's 94 in favor, 1 against. So it's very bipartisan. European countries that trade with China are caught in the middle of this clash. However, no place in the world is more affected by the semiconductor discord than Taiwan. For Taiwan is the home of the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, the so-called TSMC, the most successful and advanced semiconductor chip manufacturer in the world, period. European Union democracies, including Greece, need to understand the considerations related to these crucial economic and technological issues. Threats and opportunities abound for countries whose strategies are guided by the principles of democracy. But why are the chips so important. How have semiconductors become the world's most critical industry? Well, semiconductor chips are the foundation for the artificial intelligence revolution, for 5G networks, for robotics, for telemedicine, remote work and education, virtual and augmented reality, and streaming entertainment. Even more advanced chips will be needed in the space race, going to Mars and colonizing the moon. They are the brains behind everything. Chips are a growing component of household appliances and devices like security cameras. They are the key ingredient of the Internet of Things and of many critical military technologies. We are currently in a golden age of chip design as the quest for faster, cheaper, more memory, and lower power semiconductor chips with AI applications added on top continues unabated. Designers squeeze multiple chips together in 3D, massively in 3 dimensions, where artificial intelligence applications are determining the final architecture. So the so-called AI algorithms are compute hungry. AI programs must rapidly process data at the chip level before there is no time to send data to the cloud, do the processing at data warehouses, and then get the results back. There's no time for that. So the advanced chips, they need lower power, more memory, and they have to be faster to handle these computations at the chip level. So think, for example, the self-driving car. They are taking in a huge amounts of data that need instantaneous processing in order to make driving decisions. Stop, go, turn left, turn right, red light, stop, and so on. Here are some of the ways semiconductor chips are driving our pandemic-disrupted global economy. In digital commerce, we are moving away from the brick-and-mortar stores to online websites like Amazon. E-commerce was well established long before the COVID pandemic, but now it has accelerated. A US survey found that 37% of consumers who had never before bought anything online as of March 1st of 2020 had 4 weeks later become regular online shoppers. Those gains have steadily grown during the pandemic and are not likely to recede. That's why Amazon has exploded in value to become a nearly $2 trillion company. Almost every major company requires cloud computing, and already Amazon Web Services is the most profitable part of Amazon. Amazon, Microsoft, and Google are best positioned in this infrastructure side. In fact, the growth of Zoom has been the success story of the pandemic. That's because remote work and conferencing have become a regular part of hybrid work lives. Like the lecture tonight is hybrid. It is the new norm in academia and, in fact, the entire business world. Although many resist the idea of a world without cash, during COVID, cashlessness became a reality. We don't want to touch any cash, any paper, because we are afraid of COVID. So we all use either Apple Pay or any other form. It's the cashless transaction. So many people did not want to physically touch money because of fears, and it would infect them with the virus. For that reason, many merchants didn't want the cash either. So more and more of our transactions become touchless, and we all learn to live without the paper cash. I doubt that the movie theaters will ever return to what they were before COVID. Hollywood has already recognized this. And it's the case that movies today are increasingly released simultaneously to movie theaters and on streaming services. Sometimes they're streamed before even they go to movie theaters. Netflix during the pandemic emerged as perhaps the most important company in the history of entertainment. Disney Plus already has more than 100 million subscribers. Actually, they announced last week 118 million subscribers worldwide. HBO Max, Paramount Plus, Apple TV, and so on are devoting immense funding to the streaming wars. And then we have the electric cars, the so-called EVs, have already hit the tipping point. Tesla made the case for electric cars. Volkswagen, GM, Audi, Volvo have made it clear their futures lie in EVs. The Biden administration actually announced and is committed to electric for all United States government vehicles. China is prioritizing EVs by making consumers wait many more months for licenses for traditional vehicles. So it's faster to get the license for an EV in China. In addition, cybersecurity, digital advertising, video games, which is exploding worldwide, distributed energy renewables, as well as biotech and healthcare, are all industries running on semiconductor chips. So, as I said, chips are the brains behind everything I have just described. But where is the catch? And why the geopolitical storms surrounding the semiconductor industry? Well, what is important to remember is that the design, testing, verification, and manufacturing of the most advanced chips today depends on a relatively small number of companies in the United States, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. That's it. Chips must go through 1,000 or more exacting steps from initial design to manufacturing. By the time a chip reaches a customer, its components may have crossed dozens of international ports. So the supply chain of semiconductor chips, and in my opinion, this is really a good thing because it's forcing a collaboration. It includes companies from all these countries. No country can stand alone from beginning to end. We all need each other. And we use the small features that can be made on a chip to classify how advanced they are. The smaller the features, the more advanced the chips. State-of-the-art chips today are 3 to 5 nanometers. I mean, think for a minute. 3 nanometers, that's the thickness of 6 silicon atoms. The brains of iPhone 13 is a 5 nanometer chip designed by Apple and manufactured by TSMC in Taiwan. It contains 15 billion transistors. Mass production of TSMC's 3 nanometer chips will start in 2022, and Apple has already secured the initial supply. TSMC has also announced that they hope to start production of 2 nanometer chips in 2024. Samsung in South Korea is the other company producing 5 nanometer chips today. So both Samsung and TSMC are building new chip fabrication factories in the United States, TSMC in Arizona and Samsung in Texas. And TSMC also announced that we'll build a manufacturing facility in Japan, but primarily focusing for the not so advanced chips at the 20 nanometer level that is needed for the automobile industry. And they are also considering building a factory in Germany. It costs each one of these factories, these so-called fabs, costs anywhere between $20 to $50 billion to build it and be a state-of-the-art factory. So Intel in the United States, which once dominated the global semiconductor chip production, is scrambling today to catch up with TSMC and Samsung. Intel used to produce almost 50% of the chips manufactured in the United States, but today their market share is closer to 12%. The company is partnering with IBM, whose researchers were the first to design a 2-nanometer chip. Intel plans to build 2 large new state-of-the-art manufacturing facilities, one in Arizona and the other one in Europe. But notably absent from all this discussion, from the supply chain and the group of collaborating countries, is China. Despite huge efforts in recent years, China has been unable to achieve the competency to build the most advanced chips. And currently, as a nation, they spend $300 billion a year importing them. It is their single largest import, more than they spend on oil. A senior security expert in Washington, D.C. recently stated, "Whoever controls the design and production of these advanced microchips will set the course for the 21st century." 8 months ago, the commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific warned that China may well invade Taiwan to gain control of its semiconductor industry, and especially one company, TSMC. So it's no surprise that TSMC is currently building facilities in the United States, Japan, and explores also Germany. To summarize, semiconductors have become the ground zero of the global technology competition, and securing a steady supply of them is a top priority. According to the French Institut Montaigne in Paris, in one of their reports recently, they stated, and I'm quoting, "Today, no other industry in China shows a wider gap between stated policy goals and the technological reality. Despite its ambition to spearhead the technological space, China remains highly dependent on foreign technology. This is glaringly clear when it comes to the American licensed technologies required to create advanced semiconductor chips. In other words, what is important to keep in mind is that 90% of the intellectual property of the design, testing, and verification of the most advanced chips is controlled by American companies. After a mighty effort with its domestic semiconductor industry, China still cannot produce the cutting-edge chips. However, it would be a mistake to count China out, and there are signs that they are beginning to make progress. Alibaba, for example, which is China's e-commerce giant, recently announced that it has designed a new 7-nanometer server chip, and that it may be fabricated by China's SMIC. It is not clear whether or not SMIC will succeed, but that remains to be seen. But let's take a look at the global technology competition. And I would like to show you some slides here. And the first one I would like to show on semiconductors, I think you can clearly see here who dominates in terms of revenues and activity the semiconductor industry. Between United States, that has 47% overall of the market, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Europe, and China is only the 4% with the not advanced semiconductor chips. So, and when we talk about the manufacturing, which is the very last part of the supply chain, the actual manufacturing, that is primarily controlled for the most advanced chips by TSMC and Samsung. So you can clearly see on this one the revenues as it relates to semiconductor chips. Now, the other slide I would like to show you here is that in terms of the semiconductor equipment that is needed for the manufacturing of the advanced chips, that equipment is primarily controlled by companies in the Netherlands, in Japan, and the United States. So when it comes to, and I would like to move to the next one, which is the so-called lithography type of equipment, which is very expensive and very advanced, you can clearly see that these companies here in Europe, United States, and Japan are the ones that have the technology for the manufacturing equipment that is needed. So when the Trump and then the Biden administration announced restrictions, these companies are not allowed to sell that equipment to China. And those is part of the restriction. So even if China succeeds to design an advanced chip, they will not be able to manufacture it unless they have this kind of equipment. Just to put it in very simple terms. So, so let me move on without getting into more specifics, but here is again the other type of equipment, and you can see it's all primarily controlled by the supply chain countries that I talked about. But let me move on to the smartphones, which are the actual handheld devices that we have, like the iPhone. So for the smartphones, when it comes to them, most of us, the Westerners, think of Apple and Samsung. However, that's little more than a third of the smartphones sold. In Asia and Africa, for example, Chinese brands dominate. And the Chinese brands are 3 of the top 5 and are more than half of the top 15 brands in global sales of smartphones. So China makes many low-cost, high-quality phones. But keep in mind, these phones, they need the brains, which is the semiconductor chips. So here is moving on to, for example, the commercial drones. China dominates the market, even in the United States. And China's one particular company, DJI, for drones, is the largest player, but the United States Pentagon has labeled this company a national security risk. So there is a California drone maker, Skydio, that has less than 1% of the market, and the French firm that probably you heard about, Piraeus, is probably the most familiar European drone company. Now, when it comes to solar energy panels, again, China dominates the market. It's by far the biggest supplier in this case. And it subsidized solar manufacturers that drove down the solar panel prices, forcing many other companies out of business. But China is also under a lot of fire from accusations that their solar panel factories use forced labor from the Uyghur minority. And this has caused the United States to begin blocking imports, giving a boost to American solar producers. Then when we come to the electric cars and electric vehicles, I mean, clearly here, United States, Europe, Japan, and Korea, automakers, they rule the market currently. But when it comes to electric batteries that are needed, then China pretty much has most of the market share on the batteries. But finally, which is something that relates directly to the topic we are discussing tonight, when it comes to the 5G telecommunications hardware, and sadly I should say, telecommunications was one of those areas that in the past the United States absolutely dominated, but not anymore. But its dominance began declining after the AT&T Corporation, short for American Telephone and Telegraph, and known to most of Americans as the Bell system, was broken up into several regional bells in the early 1980s over antitrust concerns. Now, in addition to the invention of the transistor, the legendary AT&T Bell Labs developed many of the technologies underlying the modern telecommunications, including Internet protocols. In 1995, Bell Labs became part of a newly formed Lucent Technologies, which 4 years later was the world's largest telecommunications equipment company. But in 2006, Lucent merged with Alcatel, the French telecom, and by 2015, Alcatel was acquired by Nokia of Finland. So the United States government failed to monitor the decline in an infrastructure area important to national security. And this mirrors an overall decline in US infrastructure. At the same time, the US private sector's prioritization of short-term profits inhibited telecommunication investments in research and development. And here is the result that you can see now. The Huawei of China, pretty much the last 20 years, dominated the telecommunications hardware infrastructure worldwide. And then you can see the United States having only 9% of the market share, South Korea with Samsung 3%, and then this is the big role that Europe can play with the two companies in Sweden and Finland. So China's Huawei is the dominant manufacturer of cell phone equipment from the latest 4G and 5G networks, especially in third world countries. But with the US restrictions, Huawei can no longer make a lot of this equipment. And that's why, since 2017, you begin to see the decline, which is going further down as we move into the future. The United States company Cisco sells some switches and routers, and Sweden's Ericsson, Finland's Nokia, and Samsung also make some of the gear, but Huawei is by far the biggest fish swimming in the telecommunications hardware infrastructure pond. This is a problem for everyone. The United States restrictions and pressure on its democratic allies not to buy Huawei equipment is beginning to slow the rollout of 5G in general in the United States and in Europe. But this is also an opportunity, particularly for Europe's Ericsson and to some degree Nokia. And of course, it is an opportunity for Samsung and other enterprise companies that want to compete in telecommunications hardware. So, as China rose, United States fell behind in telecommunications hardware when it became preoccupied the last 20 years fighting terrorism. Even before the ascension of Xi Jinping, China's economy was expanding dramatically. In this century, the past 21 years, China's annual gross domestic product jumped from 1.2 trillion in 2000 close to $15 trillion in 2020, a 12-fold increase. And as a comparison, the United States GDP is close to $23 trillion. At the same time, China expanded its military, making major advances in space, cyber, and missile technology. But after the 9/11 attacks in 2001, the United States shifted priorities to a war on terror, spending $8 trillion in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other fronts. It changed much of its military and national security apparatus to focus fighting terrorism. So according to Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, the United States tried very hard the last 20 years to minimize areas of disagreement with China, especially on security issues. Instead, it prioritized stability, bolstering economic collaboration, and encouraging China to play a responsible role internationally. Americans viewed economic interconnectedness as a way to advance these outcomes. But while the United States technology firms focused on profitable business lines, Huawei and other Chinese companies benefited from massive government support, allowing China to achieve a major strategic goal of becoming a leader in telecommunications equipment. On the other hand, the free market economy in the United States, the last 20 years, created the 5 largest companies in the world. The names that we're all familiar with. And actually, we speak of them on a daily basis. Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft. Together, they have a combined $9.5 trillion market cap. But none of them makes 5G hardware. It's democracy versus oligarchy. 2 very different systems of governance. And this is the heart of the competition now for 5G infrastructure. 5G will greatly amplify the gathering, storage, and distribution of information for commerce, education, entertainment, and of course for the military. But the critical question, which has begun the tension between United States and China, the critical question has been the following. Should a Chinese vendor like Huawei, with unclear ties to the Chinese Communist Party and ultimately accountable to the government, really be the one building the 5G telecommunications infrastructure in Western democracy? The current United States answer under both the Trump and Biden administration is a resounding no, no way. And 5G hardware, the basic infrastructure that is needed for the artificial intelligence technology revolution, is important. 5G will be a key tool in helping us meet the challenges of the future: climate change, healthcare, education, and of course, economic justice. So I want to next spend a little time on another important facet of the semiconductor industry, one that is close to my academic heart: educating the industry's highly skilled workforce. Where will the talented scientists and engineers needed by the world's most important industry come from in the future? Despite all the problems that the United States faces, the United States semiconductor industry is thriving. Best estimates are that the United States semiconductor industry, just in the US alone, employs about 240,000 engineers and scientists. This number will probably decline slightly due to automation affecting lower skilled workers. But a substantial portion of the semiconductor workforce consists of high-skilled individuals with graduate degrees, mostly in electrical engineering and computer science, but also in other engineering disciplines and some of the sciences. About 40% of these high-skilled workers in the United States were born abroad. Since 1990, the number of American students enrolled in semiconductor-related graduate programs at US universities has not grown. It has remained steady at about 90,000. But the number of international students studying in those programs has nearly trebled from 50,000 to 140,000. So the influx of foreign students in the United States into US science and engineering graduate programs actually started going back in the 60s and the 70s. I went to the United States in 1979 and received my master's and PhD degrees in electrical engineering. Today, the largest number of foreign graduate students in the US come from India and China, with India actually leading China. About 80% of these foreign students have stayed in the United States after receiving their graduate degrees, like myself and my wife. And they have become very successful. Most semiconductor patents awarded to top American universities or corporations have at least one foreign-born inventor. Many of the world's great technology companies, such as TSMC, were founded and largely staffed by graduates of American universities. Taiwan's Maurice Chang earned his PhD at Stanford and worked at Texas Instruments for 25 years before he went back to Taiwan and found TSMC. He is not the only Taiwanese to do this. In 1998, a survey of 222 firms in Taiwan showed that 109 of them were started by entrepreneurs educated in engineering and trained in the United States. And this did not happen by accident. Starting in the 1980s, Taiwan began awarding thousands and thousands of scholarships to students to study electrical engineering graduate programs at US universities. Of course, many of the students remain in the US, but many, like Maurice Chang, returned. Taiwan is now reaping the benefits of those government scholarship investments. When I was president of the University of Southern California and I visited Taiwan and I hosted a reception for our alumni there, I was absolutely stunned that evening that 90% of the alumni who attended the reception had graduated from our electrical engineering department. In fact, our electrical engineering department is named for a Chinese billionaire entrepreneur, Ming Xie. Although he was born in the People's Republic of China, he financed his college education at USC with an inheritance from his grandparents in Taiwan. I remember as Dean of Engineering at USC that we filled many PhD slots in our engineering graduate programs with very high-caliber students from Taiwan, India, China, and other countries around the world. The top US research universities have all experienced growth of foreign graduate students in engineering and the sciences, and the country benefits when they stay. So increasingly, US universities now compete against excellent schools, Canada, Australia, and Europe, and for these talented foreign students. And Asian universities have steadily improved, particularly in sciences and engineering. China, however, currently grants more PhDs in engineering than any other country in the world. The high-tech industry in the US has been lobbying Congress to change the US immigration laws to make it easier for them to retain the foreign talent they employ. But immigration, as you probably know, is a hot-button issue in the US, as it is actually in many Western democracies. A few American politicians have even proposed, although they are the minority voices, banning foreign graduate students from some countries, and the FBI conducted high-profile espionage investigations of some Chinese students and academics. So the education and retention of the world-class talent needed by the semiconductor industry is something all of us should encourage. We need to support more public investment in science and engineering, education, as well as rational immigration policies to help the industry retain the high-value workers they need. So today, if you ask technology company executives in the semiconductor industry and its related applications, where is their highest risk looking ahead? You know what is the answer you're going to get? Shortage of engineering talent. Shortage of labor. Access to labor with engineering degree. That's the highest risk this industry is facing in the future. And Taiwan shows us how investments in advanced technical education can really pay off. This is true not only in the United States, but also in the European Union countries. China has stepped up its efforts to recruit high-tech talent in other countries, and nowhere have they tried harder than in Taiwan. Actually, TSMC was raided, 100 of their top engineers were recruited, and they went to Shanghai. But so far, they have not been particularly successful, and many of the people they succeeded in recruiting, they leave after a short time. But we should not assume that this will always be the case. Furthermore, when they do succeed, that usually amounts to a technology transfer of proprietary intellectual property. The most exotic and important tasks in making semiconductors are learned on the job, not in the graduate school. So, in closing, allow me to ask the question, what does the future hold for semiconductors? I would love to predict that the United States and China will come to some sort of accommodation that will ease the current tensions, but I don't see it in the foreseeable future. The other possibility is that we will see two semiconductor industry solar systems. One revolving around China, and you may call it the red solar system, and the other one around the United States and its democratic allies, and you may call it the blue solar system. A report by the Boston Consulting Group, commissioned by the Semiconductor Industry Association, estimated that it would cost $1 trillion in incremental, just upfront investment for self-sufficient local supply chains in the US or the EU to meet current consumption levels in semiconductors. It will result to anywhere between 35 to 65% increase in the semiconductor prices, with consequent higher prices for the end user products. So I do not think that the two parallel solar systems for making semiconductors would be good for either China or the United States or the European Union in the long run, or any one of us. I am not sure it is even possible without a lot of friction. Two solar systems would probably raise prices for everyone and almost certainly lead to more destructive disruptions as each side tries to slow down the other. It will be a different type of Cold War technology. Finally, we should keep in mind that rapidly advancing semiconductor technologies so far have flourished in the open, transparent ecosystem of Western democracy, where there is a law enforcement protecting intellectual property, controls on the flow of technology or more restrictive immigration policies risk slowing down the advance of technology. Semiconductor problems challenge our democratic institutions. Who would have thought that even 10 years ago? But democracy, which was born right here in the crucible of 2,500 years ago in Athens, overcame challenges then, and it should again now. For democracy, and let's forget the stepchild of democracy, which is the free market economy, remains the best means by which we can solve the semiconductor problems in the long run. Technology enabled by democracy is how we will flourish and assure the freedom that we cherish. Thank you. Thank you.
I will ask Professor Nikias to still stay at the podium just a little bit more, because we're resuming. It's hybrid. So first of all, I will now ask my colleagues to make two very brief comments. But let me first say that this was exceptional. I'm pretty sure that this was the first time, not just at the University of Piraeus, not just for CFIRGR, but I think the first time in Greece, that we have had a public lecture with such an analysis, bringing together technology professor here, geopolitics, have an eminent expert here, education, we're all sort of like into this. And I think there's a philosophical dimension which we'll get into during Q&A, I hope. But first, let's ask Professor Tika just to make a brief comment.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, Professor Platias and Aristotelis. It's very enlightening for us in technology to attend these presentations because we mainly focus on developing the technology, and we don't always understand the consequences of it. And believe me, Professor Nikias is one of the best speakers, and he's not only very knowledgeable, but he has a very eloquent way of presenting concepts. I have always admired him for that, and I mean it, I'm not just saying it. Let me also say that I was very thrilled to hear that electrical engineering is still a top field to study. And Professor Nikias, myself, graduated from one of the best electrical engineering departments in Europe. And we, I don't know, I think Max too. I feel very grateful for the education I got there. Thanking God, our second daughter is now starting her studies in the same field. So it's good to know that there is a good future for her. Can I ask a question?
Let's do comments first.
Okay. Okay. As I come from the technology sector, is there a role for Greece, for Eastern Mediterranean countries, Cyprus, Israel, maybe Egypt, in this semiconductor
well, I think
industry.
Absolutely. There is a role to be played, and there have to be, in my opinion, probably serious investments in this area looking ahead. Or if needed, even some government subsidies to stimulate the beginning of the growth of semiconductor industry. Because don't forget in the supply chain that when we look at the design of semiconductor chips, it's primarily software. And the very expensive production of the chips at the end, the manufacturing, that's the last part of the supply chain. So I honestly, and I think Israel shows the way. If you carefully look at Israel and their so-called Silicon Valley in Haifa, there are many semiconductor design chips companies in Israel, and therefore why not in Greece, for example? Northern European countries, they are including Netherlands, Germany, France, but also United Kingdom. They clearly have industry in this area. So why not Greece? Because the talent universities, they already graduated.
Okay, thank you very much.
And we'll come back with more questions. Professor Platias, please.
Thank you, Aris. I was really fascinated by the talk. He brought together geopolitics and computer science. And I think it has showed the future of education, and I hope that the University of Piraeus listen to it. We should be able to offer dual degrees in the future, like your university, Professor Nikias, offers, degrees like combining international relations with computer science, international relations with business. I think that should be the future of education if we want to be competitive. Now, let me turn to your presentation, Professor Nikias. I think you said some incredible things. In geopolitics, we used to have two dictums. If you control the oceans, you control the world. That started with Thucydides reporting the speech of Pericles that says, power stems from controlling the oceans, because if you control the oceans, you control trade. And if you control trade, you control wealth, therefore you control the world. Now, with the Industrial Revolution, on top of it, we had another layer. If you control energy, you control the world. And we saw in the last century what happened with oil. I mean, Middle East became the center of international politics. Great powers wanted first to control energy and also deny to the opponent. And energy became a source of war. And now Professor Nikias put forward the third dictum. If you control technology, and especially semiconductors, you control the world. That's what you said. So I think that's a fascinating talk because we have heard the voices of the future. Geopolitics is changing, and you brought one very important dimension. And again, let me play with the parallel now of semiconductors and oil. Look what's happening in the Middle East. We had wars for denial of an enemy of opposing coalition occupying the Middle East. And look what you said, that the possibility that a Taiwanese company falls under Chinese control, that's a red line for the West, and that's a cause of war. That's a major revolution in international relations. Certainly, technology and semiconductors are being discussed as a geopolitical red line and a cause of war. That's completely fascinating. Now let me turn to the US grand strategy. Let's see how the US managed to win the Cold War. Through geopolitical competition, economic warfare, and technological denial. These three combined cracked the Soviet Union, and essentially the West managed to prevail without war. That was the recipe for success during the Cold War. And then we had American unipolarity. And you said some fascinating things. Instead of competing with the rising power, they engaged. So they did something that you don't do in international relations. You help your opponent become stronger. And at the same time, you let control of critical sectors like communications and semiconductors slip away. And instead of competing with the Chinese, you are fighting Osama bin Laden in the mountains of Afghanistan. That's complete strategic mistakes. And during this period, when the West was fighting Osama bin Laden and terrorism, China has grown, and now it controls 18% of the world GDP. And here comes the following. When you control wealth, you can convert it to the military power. But you need technology to be able to convert that. So what is really played right now in international politics is the fear of the West that China will be able to convert its economic might via technology to military might, and this will change the balance of power. So my analysis is that the United States has played its card very badly. It was endowed with huge resources, something like 24% of control of the world wealth, 50% of the world military expenditures, and with its allies, 75% of the world wealth and military expenditures. Therefore, China should not have been an issue. But by neglecting these sectors, and you gave the data, the United States, they used to control 40% of the semiconductor industry. Now it's 12% and declining if they don't reverse it. Therefore, it got itself in a huge problem. And now one word about China. China started emulating. I mean, stealing or copying or whatever best practices. But because now the West has adopted a technological denial strategy, make it very difficult to get technology, it starts innovating. So if this model succeeds, then the West has really serious problem. I mean, if you look at the vision of the Chinese, in the next 4 years, they expect to reach 75% self-sufficiency, 75% self-sufficiency, autonomy. And that will be a huge game changer. And now I conclude with one question. How did the US manage to do that? I mean, how they managed not to understand that telecommunications, and especially the infrastructure technology communication, has strategic implications. How they manage to lose the advantage on the semiconductor industry?
This one, let me answer that question, and then I'll come back with a few other comments, Professor Platias. But it's not how they managed. You see, in the United States, in many ways, they left it up to the free market economy. And without pretty much any, at least government oversight, whether overall the country is going in the right direction or not when it comes to telecommunications hardware. There were a few voices back in 2008, 2007, 2008 that, hey, we may be actually up in Congress at hearings. Hey, we may be losing here in the hardware telecommunication infrastructure. We used to have AT&T. We broke it up into the Bell systems, and then these companies were acquired by European companies, and we no longer have that lead. Okay, but you're right. Congress didn't pay the proper attention to that. while at the same time, as I explained here, China, with serious government subsidies, they wanted to dominate in this area. However, in fairness to the free market economy, by letting the free market economy, it gave the United States and the world the 5 largest companies in the world ever. The Amazon, the Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, and so on, and Google. But the biggest issue moving forward is it's whether you want, as I said, a Chinese company with unclear ties to the Communist Party to build the telecommunications infrastructure in a Western democracy. That's really the question. So the so-called entity list that was created, or the first restrictions when they were imposed on Huawei, and then the list expanded, it was to answer this question that in the US is absolutely not. And that's a question that European countries and European democracies, they're going to have to answer by themselves, on their own. I mean, it's a decision they have to make. One clarification, it's on the manufacturing on the chips, which is the last part of the supply chain, that Intel, as a US company, it went down from 47 to 12%. However, 90% of the technology when it comes to the design of the advanced chips is controlled by US companies.
And patents.
And patents. Okay. So that's why the United States is very, very sensitive to intellectual property protection. And therefore, there is a fury of intellectual property theft. Finally, another thing you said, Professor Platias, which is so true. In fact, there is actually a book written making the argument, and that book was published decades ago by one of our USC professors, actually, from Spain originally, sociologist, Manuel Castells. He wrote a book where he gave a thorough analysis. Okay, his argument was that the invention of microprocessor in Silicon Valley in 1970, which actually we just celebrated the 50 years, which is the first brain, okay, brains behind everything, right? It was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. Because that gave the electronics technology revolution that exploded the last 50 years. And very quickly, within a decade and a half, the Soviet Union could not catch up with it. And Gorbachev was the one who clearly saw it. Because it's one thing, the economic statistics that they were publishing for the world, it's another thing what they were seeing internally. And the invention of microprocessor, this professor argued, was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union as an oligarchic society.
Before I open it up to the floor for questions, I'll actually ask one. Obviously, tonight's lecture was an eye-opener. During the old Cold War, people used to obsess about the missile gap. We teach these things. And now it's going to be a chip gap. Who would have imagined? And I was listening to Professor Platias complaining about how was the U.S. so mistaken in its approach, and I was reminded of something that Winston Churchill said. You can always count, I can't do his voice, but you can imagine it. You can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they have exhausted every other option. Now, coming to my question, though, there are two things that two almost opposing things that are happening at the same time. On the one hand, there's no doubt that China has been ascendant. It's the rising power. In the past decades, Chinese power almost across the board has increased. On the other hand, and also there's no doubt, China is becoming more autocratic. No doubt about it. On the other hand, just looking at your data, what is striking is that if you just do not focus just on the US, but on US, Taiwan, Japan, the European Union, primarily Holland, I think, they tend to be the players. They also tend to be democracies. So let me be specific. Is there a link between semiconductors and the regime in a country?
Well,
in your opinion?
Yeah, I think I said it at the end that it's the open democratic society and the open free market economy that allowed the semiconductor industry to flourish the last 50 years and to reach the point that it did.
And can an autocratic regime, through its own processes, you think?
Well, I mean, as Professor Platia said, China will definitely innovate. If you ask me how many years behind is compared to the West, I would say in the semiconductor industry, they're probably anywhere between 8 to 10 years behind. Okay, that's the lag of time we're talking about. No more than that. But let me bring up one more interesting point. Okay, there are very few numbers left between 0 and 5 nanometers.
Absolutely.
Between 0 and 3 nanometer chips. I mean, what is a 3 nanometer chip? That means the size of the transistor is 3 nanometers. You take 1 meter, you break it into 1 billion pieces, and it's only 3 pieces of that. That's the size of the transistor. That's why in a 5 nanometer chip, you can squeeze 15 billion transistors, like the chip in an iPhone. Okay, it has 15 billion transistors. So there are very few numbers left. Then we go down to 2, but do not underestimate the complexity is orders of magnitude. And the difficulty is even more diabolically orders of magnitude, going from 3 to 2 nanometers or going from 5 down to 3. But there aren't too many numbers left. The question is, what is next? Okay, that's why now the emphasis is on the 3D multiple chips being squeezed together in 3 dimensions with the AI application architecture dominating the design. So special purpose designs. But if we want to look ahead into the future, several decades down the road, and both China and United States and Europe are investing heavily, it's in the area of quantum computing. And actually, at least what was publicly published in the last 5 years is that China was making even more serious investments in quantum computing, which is the next technology to get ahead after the semiconductor chips. They are making serious investments over the US. I personally, on behalf of universities, lobby the United States Congress, and I had meetings with senators and congressmen on an annual basis about the need for, and I did write an article that was published 3.5 years ago in the Washington Post, that the United States was falling behind in this making serious investments on quantum computing. And I remember in one of my meetings with a congressman of the who was on the appropriations committee for the intelligence community, and I was making the argument to it, and then he got a little bit upset and he said, "We're investing and I cannot talk about it." In other words, giving me the impression we're investing even more, but we don't talk about it. So that's one area to watch looking ahead into the future.
So I think we now know what Professor Nikia's next lecture will be on: geopolitics and quantum computing. Let's open the discussion. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question? Yes, and then Professor Smiti, and then, okay.
Introduce Professor Virgu, the chairperson of the Informatics department.
Thank you, Professor
And thank you very much
Platias.
for coming here tonight.
Okay, I represent the Department of Informatics together with Professor Tsichrintis. Professor Nikias, thank you so much for your so enlightening talk and very informative for us who are working in the informatics area. I was wondering, what are your views about education in informatics? you mentioned that a lot of Chinese people, Indian people, a lot of people came to universities in the United States,
Right.
and then they left and went back home, and they took all this knowledge back. So it seems to me that you are pointing out that this is very important. So I was wondering whether the connection of educational institutions in Europe and maybe other democratic countries would be an advantage, an asset, and something to grow.
I honestly think it is an advantage if the employment opportunities are created in Europe or in Greece. I have to tell you, when I graduated from Etzovia in 1977, we were a class of 40 electrical engineers. 20 of them went and studied in the United States. 50% of the graduates. So if the employment opportunities are created here, then this talent will stay here. And in terms of international students coming to the United States, I believe is not a unique phenomenon in the US. The same thing is happening at Australian universities and also in Europe, everywhere in Europe, including United Kingdom. Which, by the way, I think it's a good thing. We are more international. Look at the supply chain. Look at the supply chain of semiconductors. We are all interconnected. Okay, so many different countries. Okay, it's a wonderful thing. No single nation has absolute control from A to Z of the semiconductor industry. So we are forced, either we like it or not, to work together.
Professor Marilena Simiti?
Yes, Professor Nikias, thank you for your excellent lecture. I'm a political sociologist, so I apologize if the question is totally wrong. But I was wondering whether the United States is facing also another challenge that China does not face. And this is since technology has become such a critical resource, invading every aspect of social economic life, whether technological firms in the United States and big players may become more and more autonomous, undermining the ability of the state to regulate activities. And this aspect does not exist in China. Thank you.
Yeah, it does exist in China,
No,
and that's why you see some friction between very large corporations in China and the Chinese government. You're absolutely right. Some of the technology companies have grown to become too large, too big. Then they have a tremendous influence. And but that's why United States Congress is seriously looking into more government regulation. And I will not be surprised from some of them that have become too big that they may be broken up, which is exactly what happened with AT&T in the early 80s. One judge in a court broke it up into 7 regional bell systems. So I'm not ruling that out in the next decade.
Mr. Dean Sirigos, who represents the National Herald, the U.S.-based historic Greek-American newspaper, will be waiting for your article reporting our event.
The microphone.
With regard to quantum computing, I have not moved yet from fascination to knowledge. So I have a basic question. To what degree would quantum computing technology, as we now see it, replace semiconductor technology? Or is it only one basic area, for example, code breaking, where it's way ahead?
It's not going to happen overnight. It may not happen in our lifetime. just to completely replace it. Okay. However, I'll tell you my fear when it comes to quantum computing, even when because quantum computers are going to require very low temperature, sub-zero. They're going into the lowest you can get, and therefore it's not going to be anything portable. Okay, as we have with the semiconductor chips. However, my biggest fear is that when we reach that level of quantum computing, which by the way we're not anywhere near, that's the vision thing. But reaching that level, then I got news for you. They can break any code very quickly. So the whole cybersecurity where you protect data and all that, it can be broken. And which is going to force a new research and development in the area of cybersecurity. But that's my biggest fear. And but anyway, I wouldn't expect quantum computing to replace the semiconductor chips anytime.
Is there any other question? Yes, please. Sir Angelakos.
Professor Nikias, you mentioned, I will set a naive question. You mentioned South Korea with the chips, Taiwan, European countries, US. What could be done in Greece for research or factories you mentioned? It needs trillions of dollars. But what could be done in Greece to foster this industry?
Right. A couple of things. One is that if the right incentives are given for new business startups, especially in the area of design, the software side of the design of semiconductor chips, and the whole IP that comes with it, I think that would be one thing that it could create the let's say the blossoming of industry. The second is to probably provide incentives even to the large companies, because remember, the large companies are looking for talent. That's the biggest risk they have. Greece has that talent graduating from its universities. So many companies will find it attractive to open operations here because they can hire this talent, and then they go through very intense internal training. So to me, that could be a quick and probably the easiest way of establishing a presence in the semiconductor supply chain. And the least expensive in terms of infrastructure is the software side, not the hardware.
Do you have a follow-up question?
In practical, for a simple man like me, in practical steps.
Practical steps.
1, 2, 3, 4.
In practical steps, I would take the number of semiconductor companies one by one and see what kind of incentives I can provide to them to open operations here in Greece, because they can hire the talent. It's here.
By whom? Is the government doing anything? Private, individual? What can be done?
Both.
Yeah, but departments like the Department of Informatics are precisely producing this graduate, and the Polytechnic, and he's alluded that he graduated, is producing this talent. So the talent is here. It's a question of bridging it with industry. But the talent is here in Greece like Israel can be a place that can attract these companies. And most importantly, as you suggested, on the startup level.
Right.
And not on the hardware, but mostly on the software. It's combination of incentives because we do have the people. I mean, Professor Chikridis will tell you, they bring in the market 200 persons per year in this department, in the University of Piraeus, and the Polytechnic probably brings more. Oh, Professor Nikias, yes, please.
So that there is no misunderstanding, now we both graduated from Mechovio, but the University of Piraeus, the computer science department, produces much, much, much better programmers and software engineers. Right. We are the best in this country.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't say it. The World Ranking says so. The department, in terms of computer education, ranks within the top 100 universities in the world, according to Microsoft Academic Search. It's not what we say; they say.
Yeah, okay. Absolutely.
Is there any other final question? Yes, Ms. Pantuna.
Thank you.
PhD graduate from our department.
Thank you, Professor Nikias, for bringing together IR with technology. It was very interesting. So speaking of strategy, American strategy in the field, I was wondering, from your perspective, is it possible for the U.S. to make up for the losses of such previously effective strategy in the field? I mean,
sure.
Is it possible
for
America to do the right thing in short-term perspective?
Yeah. This is you need to understand. This is the beauty of America, in my humble opinion. Okay, that which actually I would say is probably the beauty of any democratic society. Democracies, by their very nature, okay, because there are many voices, many opinions, many disagreements, actually, very intense disagreements all the time. And even when there is a threat, there are many disagreements how to deal with the threat. Okay, so there is always delay reacting to a threat because of the very nature of a democratic process. And even if you have to declare war, it has to be debated and so on. So there is delay reacting to a threat. But once the reaction takes place, then there is a fury in that reaction. In other words, the serious investments are made as a national strategy, and therefore everybody buys into it. So the answer to your question is yes. This is exactly what happened in the 50s with the Sputnik moment, when the Soviet Union put a man, in orbit, and the United States was far behind, but there was slow reaction to that. But when it did, you saw the results. So I'm not. I never doubted the strength, in this case, of the United States reacting.
Okay, I think that at this point we can all agree that as a result of today's lecture and discussion, we are better informed. We have new tools to look at contemporary developments, and we have questions, and having questions is something that is very good, and perhaps a better understanding of the brave new world that awaits us. Professor Nikias, thank you once again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.